I think it is a global betrayal to be one of the biggest polluting countries in the world and then to remove yourself from a desperately needed multilateral conversation that the United States is a part of, being one of the biggest emitters and the wealthiest country in the world. Because when we're talking about climate finance, our country should be involved in these reparations funds and helping with this process because it needs to be a global effort to move off of fossil fuels. People are in different stages in their countries of what they need to do to collectively have us all survive. The United States is on a drill baby drill pattern right now. 90% of the global extraction increase is happening in the United States. Us not being there is not a good thing because we should feel the collective pressure of other governments looking at us and saying, what are you doing? The absence of the United States being there shows a lack of care, a denialism, and also a furtherance of the systemic problems of capitalism, of imperialism, of racism, of colonization, of patriarchy. I mean, these things need to be called out. It's a furthering of that agenda. And the rise of authoritarian governments, which are happening here and being encouraged by our administration. But at the same time, I was glad to see other governments just let's move on. We need to move forward with an agenda, regardless if the United States is here or not. And of course, I'm very much hoping that will change.
Welcome to the latest edition of Code Green, Conversations for a Future We Want and Our Kids Deserve. I am very pleased to bring you my next guest. She is someone who has been in the forefront of women and climate and action and international reach for as long as I've been doing this, and probably longer. She's the author of a couple of books, most recent one very much appropriate to this moment we're in. The first one was too. She is just back from Brazil, COP30, Belém. There are quite a few people I know who were there. I've not yet been to a COP, but she was my first choice because I really believe she and I bumped into each other at an event during a Climate Week in New York that women are key. I mean, it's the only way we're going to get out of this and move forward. And she has been doing this for a couple of decades at least. We're going to find out exactly how long, but we're going to find out all about. She's just off the plane, literally from Brazil. So thank you so much for joining us, Osprey Orielle Lake. It's a pleasure and an honor. And I see the books behind you. I know you've written a couple, and you probably have some of my favorite books in your library right there. Welcome to Code Green. It's really exciting to have you here. This is a new platform for me, but you and I are not new at this at this beat, are we?
Well, thanks so much for inviting me to have this conversation with you. And thank you for all your dedication to the narrative and getting the story out about the climate crisis. I know you've been doing it for a long time, and I wish more people were as dedicated as you are to this critical, urgent matter. So yeah, thanks for
Anyway,
having
so committed, I may end up committed. That's my line here. I should mention that you are the founder and executive director of a wonderful organization called WECAN, Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, just to place you in the world. And how long has this organization been alive?
Well, we started the organization in 2009, at the end of 2009, and it really came about because at that time, President Obama had been elected. We were looking at the climate negotiations, which were in Copenhagen that year, and looking for like a major breakthrough, hopefully, with that new administration around how governments were approaching the climate crisis. And to make a very long story short, the results were not strong enough. I had not run a nonprofit organization. I was not trained in one. I was writing and doing my artwork. And I was walking in the redwood forests, which are native here to my home in Northern California. And I just had this really sinking feeling that, I think we all have these different moments where we realize we have to be the actors in this historic moment. And I started doing a lot of research and found that one of the untold stories is not only are women being most impacted by the climate crisis due to gender inequality around the world, but also that they were the key actors in so many solutions, and yet those stories had not been told. And things have changed since 2009. It still needs a lot more work to understand this gender dynamic, but still, it is really important for people to understand the role that women are taking in resolving the climate crisis and leading solutions.
And we're going to dive deeper into that in part two because there is so much to talk about. But let's segue from what was Copenhagen to Nopenhagen and to Brazil, where everyone said everything is riding on this. Of course, we say that each year. at a COP. I haven't been yet. You have been. I think you said this is your 10th. Tell us, hot off the press, just off the plane, what your impressions were while there. Maybe they're shifting a little bit now that you're back. You tell us. We'll listen.
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things is of course, every time we do go to a COP now, the urgency is beyond words, even because the climate crisis is accelerating and governments are not moving fast enough.
Right.
So it's really important to contextualize these COPs. I mean, I think a lot of people in the field that I am in don't go to the COP thinking everything's going to be resolved there. We don't go to the COP to resolve the climate crisis. We go to the COP to stop really bad things from happening, to give us more space and time to resolve matters and to intervene and discuss with governments, advocate, protest for the change we want to see. So it's just important to realize this is not where our eggs need to be all in this basket for sure. That said, I think a big takeaway from Berlin is that it was really a struggle to have it located at the mouth of the Amazon. It's right, Belém is right on a river that goes right into the Amazon, into the Brazilian Amazon. And it was not easy for President Lula of Brazil to have it there because it was uncomfortable. There wasn't all the lodging people are used to. It wasn't a big city. And so there was a lot of struggle for it to be there. But the point was for delegates from countries around the world, for civil society to put a mark and say the Amazon is at a critical tipping point. We are going to be in the Amazon and have people have this experience. And I think it was successful in that way because the fact is the Amazon is the largest rainforest in the world. Through scientifically, we all over the world are dependent on the Amazon for our weather patterns, the rain, the climate all over the world. So if the Amazon is destroyed through the climate crisis and through also a lot of agricultural business, different extraction that is taking place in the Amazon and illegal logging and fires, this is something that impacts all of us. So I think it was a really good exclamation point to have this be in the Amazon. And then the other factor is the role of Indigenous peoples. And we were really on Indigenous lands. We are, in a place where there's many Indigenous peoples. And it was, slated as the Indigenous COP. I don't think it really lived up to that in terms of what happened inside the formal negotiating spaces, but there were thousands of Indigenous people from all over the world and certainly all over the Amazon that were there. And it's good for people to know that there's not only the formal negotiating space called the Blue Zone, but there's all kinds of other avenues for people to present and work and strategize. There was a people summit that was run by civil society at a nearby university. There were all different kinds of venues, an Indigenous village that was the Indigenous COP, where many Indigenous people stayed and had ceremony and had reflections and were sharing traditional ecological knowledge. So it was very powerful to be in the presence of so many Indigenous peoples. And also there was a big civil society march halfway through the COP with over 70,000 people, many of whom were Indigenous. And we need to recognize that most of the biodiversity left on Earth is on Indigenous lands or stewarded by Indigenous peoples. So it's no small thing to say Indigenous rights are a climate solution and that we need to listen to Indigenous people who have stewarded their lands and protected the rivers and forests and the last of the biodiversity on Earth. So I don't want it to be seen as sort of a second note. It's kind of a primary note that Indigenous peoples are included in the negotiations and respected and their rights and their land and territories honored. And that's a big struggle.
Mhm.
That said, they were not allowed into a lot of the negotiating rooms through the formal processes. And in fact, there was a couple of very big protests that were held and, where they broke into the first entry point of the Blue Zone nonviolently, peacefully. And unfortunately, the UNFCCC Secretariat really cracked down very hard and brought in a lot of militarization that was very intimidating to civil society, to Indigenous peoples. WECAN and other groups wrote a letter saying, you've gone too far. We're here in peace and, in solidarity to do all we can. And in a democracy, we have the right to stand up when our lives are on the line and we don't agree with what's going on. So that was part of what was going on. And then in terms of the formal negotiations, um, I think I should just say some losses and wins, if that sounds
Yeah,
good.
I think that's important too. Let me just ask one quick question. Are there representatives inside the talks for Indigenous people, like one or two or five, or
Yes, there's
really
definitely
not
there
included
was
at all?
yes, Indigenous peoples represented large delegations inside the COP,
I would hope
but
so.
it's also important to realize there's different delegations and different constituencies within the UNFCCC formal process. So there's lots of civil society presence. But which rooms you're allowed into, when you can have interventions, is a whole other matter. And
Right.
Indigenous people are not recognized as nations, which they should be. And so they're not given equal status in terms of who's negotiating over their lands or their forests, as an example. So that's the complication. But I would start with maybe the losses, which is that speaking of representation, every year there's been an increase in fossil fuel lobbyists who are coming into these spaces. And there was over 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists at this particular COP, so bigger than any country delegation other than Brazil. So you have to sort of look at the insanity of the point of these COPs is to get off of fossil fuels and decrease carbon emissions. And yet they are the biggest lobbyists that are there. So there's a huge problem there. And there are all kind of campaigns, kick polluters out. Like, what are they doing in this space?
And why isn't fossil fuels mentioned in?
Yeah. So that that leads to, one of the big failures of this COP is that even though at COP28 2 years ago in the UAE there was a strong mandate in the final outcome document saying that governments agreed to transitioning off of fossil fuels. And that has not been brought up strongly again since then. And one of the big failures of this COP was that fossil fuels were not in the final outcome documents. There was no pushing forward on the very thing that we need to talk about. And so that was incredibly frustrating. And I will say that the COP presidency, every year the presidency changes, depending on which country you're in. I will say that the Brazilian COP presidency efforted to get fossil fuels into the outcome documents. And at one point, there were 80 countries standing up, had a press conference that was led by the Marshall Islands of climate vulnerable countries saying, we want fossil fuels in the outcome documents. And they were unable to get consensus on it. And so the COP presidency ended up having to say in the final plenary, that didn't happen. But, he has his presidency for the year and he's giving himself the, focus of working on a mechanism for fossil fuel phase out and to stop deforestation. But it had to be done in that manner because governments would not agree.
So just help me understand, those of us who have not been there, like who are they trying to kid? They're not allowing fossil fuels, two words, to be in any written agreement. I mean, clearly that is the problem. That's why everybody's there. Um, like, what do they really think they're achieving by being so, if I may say, ridiculous?
Well, the thing is that there are fossil fuel producing countries who don't want to have that conversation. And that's why civil society is there, Indigenous peoples are there, why all of us are there is to continue to hold up this mirror and make demands because there is a central lie at the core of this. It's a compromised space because as long as the fossil fuel lobbyists are there, and fossil fuel producing countries who want to continue the fossil fuel economy are pushing their agenda. We have to remember this is a space that has to operate on consensus and agreement. And so it's not that there aren't a lot of countries who are also demanding fossil fuel phase out. It's that there's a lot of countries who are still invested in the continuation of business as usual. And there you have the problem. And so it's not that not everyone's on the same page, but you have to still be able to get it through the door and negotiate these things. The trade-off was that, this is sort of like a win, if you will, is that civil society has been working for the last 2 years very strongly to push forward something we call the Belém Action Plan, BAM, but it got translated differently by governments and negotiating something called the Just Transition Mechanism. And this is a critical win that we've been engaged in as an organization. We work with the Women and Gender constituency, which is a really powerful constituency of groups, women's groups all over the world, and many others Can Action International, can't wait, Climate Action Network International, excuse me, and many other groups really pushed forward for this mechanism because we've been talking about the just transition, which is a way of talking about getting off of fossil fuels and going to clean energy. And that was passed. And it was passed in a really powerful way. And that was a push from civil society and other countries that really got us finally to a place of an agreement about how to implement the just transition. And just transition, in the definition that we are operating in, is certainly and very importantly about how workers are going to move off of fossil fuels into jobs that are good jobs in the renewable energy sector. Very important. The just transition framework was started by labor movements, and they need to be honored for that hard work. And it has also expanded to mean many other things. So, as an example, in this agreement that was adopted, that was hard fought for, we also see very powerful language around Indigenous rights, around care work, informal care work, meaning, the economy that primarily women stand up for, which is unpaid often and unacknowledged, all the care work that goes on. And how does that fit into the new economy that is a low carbon economy? Human rights were discussed in this new adopted program, as well as a big discussion that is always going on is how do we provide funds to low-income countries, and primarily countries that have not caused the climate crisis but are being impacted the first and worst by it. And how do we have justice in climate finance with the countries that are wealthy and who have caused most of the pollution from fossil fuels? And that's part of the Paris Climate Agreement, that governments that are wealthy and causing this pollution shall be responsible for this financing, which they're always evading. And it's a whole other complicated policy wonk conversation. But within this just transition mechanism, there was strong language about these funds being grant-based versus loans, because again, there's so much debt that we put the global south in with a lot of this programming, and that has to stop. There has to be funds that are grants based. It's reparations funds. They are funds that are owed, as far as we're concerned, to the global south because of the harms that the global north has caused.
Mhm.
And so that was a real win. We also got a win on the 9-year BLM Gender Action Plan. We've been working for years for something called the GAP, the Gender Action Plan, that policies across all sectors will take into account gender responsive policies. And so that is something that we also won. So there was a lot of losses, but there was also some wins. But overall, it's a corrupted space. There's just no way around it. It's compromised because of the things we've talked about. And lastly, and then I'll hand the floor back to you, I think another big win that happened is WECAN sits on the steering committee of something called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is not part of the formal UNFCCC process, but it's a mechanism for governments to have a space outside of the COP to be able to create a mechanism to negotiate collectively getting off of fossil fuels. It's really important. And for the first time in the closing plenary, through the COP presidency, they acknowledged the treaty, which is really unusual because it's a civil society initiative that has now been picked up by governments. There are 18 governments that have now endorsed this treaty. And they announced that in April of 2026, there's going to be a very big conference in Colombia, hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands, for countries to meet on fossil fuel phase out. And so I think it's never said explicitly, but there's an understanding that something else is needed, that we're out of time. And this conversation around fossil fuel phase out has got to happen. And now we even have the UNFCCC acknowledging through the COP presidency this other mechanism through the treaty, the fossil fuel treaty, that will be taking place in April. So that was a really big win. So I'll stop there as some top lines.
Thank you. That's a good download and a couple of key questions. One, how did it feel to be there versus in a petro state the last couple of years? Did that make a difference? I mean, you couldn't ask for, like one is the problem, one is the solution if we don't kill off the rainforest first. It was a good choice, it seems. And logistics, it seems like there's never enough room, but I'm sure this one was even more challenging for reasons that are obvious. And there was some, Fox was saying, oh, to have this COP, they had to go through the rainforest and destroy so many hectares. And, that's beside the point. But that's not what I'm really asking. What I'm asking is just that backdrop of, being in a petrochemical state, whatever you want to call it, versus in the rainforest, ground zero, if you will. How did that feel different? Logistics aside.
Yeah, logistics aside, it was really amazing. I mean, I've been at the last three COPs that were in more repressed governments and petro states, as you said, from Egypt to Dubai to Azerbaijan, right? And so, you know, one, this has been the first time after 3 years we've been able to have a march on the streets, have civil society spaces, be able to do all this work outside of the COP that creates pressure on governments, which is really important,
Mhm.
and so all of that was fantastic. The freedom that we had to express ourselves, when we were in the three other COPs, we had to be very, very careful what we said. We were given all kind of dictates about, not getting into trouble, what kinds of things we were posting, serious, serious things to abide by country laws. And so this was completely different. The protests that I mentioned, the marches on the street, really hearing people speak out. It was fantastic. The People's Summit, which had not been able to take place for 3 years, was able to happen. So a lot of movement building, a lot of strategy. So yeah, it was just absolutely fabulous in that way, and being able to meet with colleagues in different ways. It was really healthy. So yeah, I think it was a real positive.
And speaking of unhealthy, what did the lack of presence by us, the United States, do in a positive or negative way? Outrageous as that is, but not surprising from this administration.
Yeah, I mean, it has, as you say, both. I mean, first of all, I just think I wrote about this earlier when the administration pulled out of the Paris Agreement, which is in the first administration they did it, and now so this is the second time. I think it is a global betrayal to be one of the biggest polluting countries in the world, and then to remove yourself from a desperately needed um, conversation that is a multilateral conversation that the United States is a part of, being one of the biggest emitters and the wealthiest country in the world. It's outrageous. And so I think there was a real absence there, because when we're talking about climate finance, we should be paying, our country should be involved in these reparations funds and helping with this process, because it needs to be a global effort to move off of fossil fuels. No one can do it on their own, and people are in different stages in their countries of what development they need and what they need to do to collectively have us all survive. So that was super frustrating. And I think that on the other hand, the United States can also be an obstruction to forward motion. So there was probably things that might have moved more smoothly without the United States being there and getting in the way of forward progress, because we have to remember the United States is on a drill baby drill pattern right now. U.S. alone amounts for about 90% right now of the global extraction increase is happening in the United States, right? And so us not being there is not a good thing, because we should feel the collective pressure of other governments looking at us and saying, "What are you doing?" So I think that the absence of the United States being there shows a betrayal to the world community and a lack of care, which we're seeing in our own country every single day, and a denialism that is really outrageous, and also a furtherance of the systemic problems of capitalism, of imperialism, of racism, of colonization, of patriarchy. I mean, these things need to be called out. It's a furthering of that agenda and the rise of
Growth,
authoritarian
growth,
government.
growth at any cost.
Yeah. And the rise of authoritarian governments, which are happening here and being encouraged by our administration. So all of those things are certainly felt. But at the same time, I was glad to see other governments just let's move on.
Mhm.
And we can't, you know, we need to move forward with an agenda regardless if the United States is here or not. And of course, I'm very much hoping that will change in the nearest future as possible.
And I'm sure the other countries heard from people who were there that we're not behind this. The people are not behind this, at least,
Oh yeah, I mean, there was subnational in the United States. There was subnational representation there. So, and negotiations going on at a subnational level, and civil society showing up. So people are clear, you know,
Gavin
what
Newsom,
the United States. Yeah.
our governor, yeah, briefly showed up. What about China? I mean, while Trump and company bury their heads in the sand, ostrich style, of course, China is eating our lunch, as Bill McKibben says, and serving it on a silver platter in terms of renewable energy expansion, development, success. And it's, another one of the hypocrisies of this administration. Trump's supposed to be the great businessman, the great negotiator. Meantime, we're being left in the dust in terms of developing solar, EVs, batteries, renewable energy um, moving forward.
And that continues to be the case. I mean, China was part of the big push to help this just transition mechanism go through. So they were really helpful in that way. And it is true. I mean, they're rebuilding their economy to be based on renewable energy. So they're far outshining in that department. So that will continue. And the United States will be left in the dust. That's a reality because right now, as we've all been hearing, renewables are less expensive than fossil fuels. And that is the new economy that is emerging.
Okay, so any last thoughts before we close? Now that you're back, a half a world away, what are your gut feelings about this COP compared to others, and in the context of this hot moment, for lack of a better term?
I know that not everyone needs to be focused on the COP and it's not part of people's daily lives. I do think it's important that people pay attention. It is where this negotiation is happening. It is the only time every year where all governments come together and small countries that are being impacted the most, island nations, have a voice, Indigenous peoples, frontline communities, on par on a global stage. And I know that it can be really frustrating from a distance observing this COP process, but I think it's really important that people stay tuned in and continue to put pressure on their governments, not just here, but around the world, because it's not the only place that climate is having front and center discussions, but it is a primary one while we do work the rest of the year. And so I would just encourage people to not write it off as just a failed space, because the more that we utilize that space, the more we're going to be victorious and create the changes we need to.
Thank you so much for what you have been doing, what you are doing, what you will do. We're going to close part one for this download from Brazil. Thanks so much for that. And part two is going to be all about your work with WECAN and women around the world, and also your most recent book, which is The Story is in Our Bones: How Worldviews and Climate Justice Can Remake a World in Crisis. That's going to be kind of hands-on. I hope people will tune in for that. I promise you it will be just as enlightening and inspiring, but honest as part one has been. Thanks so much.
Thank you.